Okay. So we're going to go ahead and get started if you don't mind. I'd like to officially welcome everyone to the uh, Northern Virginia Baha'i Center program on Baha'i Heroes and Heroines series. Um, this is a series that started maybe a year or two back. And as you know, we used to have these wonderful presentations and talks at the Northern Virginia Baha'i Center. But since COVID, we've been having them online. And it's always so nice that we see so many wonderful people joining from all over. This is the third session that our dear friend John has accepted to do for us. It's on Juliet Thompson, a spiritual portrait of Juliet Thompson by John Russo. And what we'll do is we're gonna go ahead and start with a prayer, and then we're gonna hand it off to Marissa to officially introduce John and the topic tonight. So if you bear with me, I'm gonna go ahead. I'm going to start with the first, with our opening prayer.
ای خداوند مهربان، قلوب را به نور هدایت کبری منور فرما. جانها را به بشارت عظما حیات بخش. چشما را به مشاهده انوارت روشن کن. گوشها را به استماع ندایت شنوا فرما. ما را در ملکوت تقدیست داخل نما. به نفسات روح القدس زنده کن. حیات ابدی بخش، کمالات آسمانی عطا فرما. خداوندا جانهای ما را فدای خود کن و ما را روح جدید آسمانیده سرور ابدی بخش موفق به خدمت عالم انسانی نما سبب الفت بین قلوب کن خداوندا از خواب بیدار فرما و عاقل و هوشیار کن تا به اسرار کتاب مقدست واقف گردی و به روز کلماتت پی بری تویی مقتدر تویی دهنده تویی مهربان
Dear friends, it is an honor for me to introduce tonight's speaker, John Russo, a Baha'i since 1973, who is a retired lawyer and federal acquisition and contracting consultant. John was born and raised in South Philadelphia as a Catholic, the eldest of 6 siblings. He served as an altar boy and choir boy for a number of years in elementary school. He was planning to go to a seminary to become a Catholic priest after high school, but his parents felt that he should complete college before pursuing the priesthood. After completing his college education, he served in the US Navy as a linguist, cryptanalyst for Navy intelligence, and he was stationed at that time in South Dade, Miami, Florida, and subsequently as an intelligence analyst for the Center for Naval Analysis in Roslyn, Arlington, Virginia. After he graduated from George Mason University School of Law in Arlington, Virginia, he practiced law for a number of years in Reston and Tyson's Corner. Additionally, he has over 40 years of experience in the federal acquisition and contracting fields, both in government and as a consultant in the same industry. Having been a Baha'i for 38 years, he has served on local spiritual assemblies of various communities, and for several years, he served as the principal of the One World Baha'i School at the Northern Virginia Baha'i Center. Currently, he resides in the town of Vienna, Virginia, with his wife, Yasmin, and his 2 children, Sean and Lydia. Friends, Let me present John Russo to all of you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for participating in this presentation. Thank you to the Center Events Committee and to the Local Spiritual Assembly of Loudoun County for giving me this opportunity. As Payman mentioned, this is the third in the series called Baha'i Heroes and Heroines. Started with Louis Getzinger, and then we moved on to Thomas Breakwell, and this on Juliet Thompson, all figures from essentially the same time frame, very important figures who set in motion the Baha'i Faith in their respective areas of residence. So I'm going to share the screen with you now and see if I can find my presentation. Here we go. Can everyone see that fairly clearly?
Yes.
Good. Okay. This is a very important figure in the Baha'i Faith. This is an artist. And there's a quote from Baha'u'llah who says that arts, crafts, and sciences uplift the world of being and are conducive to its exaltation. Knowledge is as wings to men's life and a ladder for his ascent. So it's recognized, the importance of the arts is recognized by Baha'u'llah. And this is a key figure in the area of the arts for the Baha'is, a turn of the century figure who was a gravitational force for friends and those unacquainted with the faith to come to her home in New York and to learn about the faith, to study the faith. Important figures that came to visit her, and one of her key contributions was her tremendous devotion to Abdul Baha and facilitating his travels while he was in the Northeast Corridor of the United States on his trip to the United States, making her home his home, and writing so eloquently of her experiences with Abdul Baha and with others in a diary that she kept. And later on in the presentation, we will read some of the excerpts from that diary. My sources, see if I can, this is not, for some reason, the slide is not, well, here it is. Well, before we get to the sources, let me read you a quote, which I read at the beginning of each one of the presentations, which describes what is a Baha'i hero or a Baha'i heroine. It comes from a book called A Love Which Does Not Wait, which was published in 1998 by Janet Russo. And I believe Janet Russo is the daughter of former Universal House of Justice member David Rue. This I think is important for us to really contemplate as we move along in the story of Juliet Thompson. A Baha'i hero or heroine, she says that they had varying degrees of education, different levels of intellectual attainment. They died far from home while working with one common purpose, to establish the Baha'i reality of peace through unity among all people. Within this purpose, they shared a rare attribute which enabled them to do their work under the most adverse conditions with incomparable grace. They were transformed and animated by a love which does not wait, but rushes forth to serve, unburdened by expectation of reward, unfreighted with selfish concerns. They were truly Baha'is, followers of Baha'u'llah, light bearers. The source of their light may have seemed obscure to much of the world, but to them, it was as apparent as the sun. And you will see as we go through the excerpts of her life, how she fits this definition. My primary source of information for this presentation is the actual diary of Juliet Thompson. Much of the other information is secondary source and anecdotal information from various resources. It took me 3 to 4 weeks to actually assemble all this information and to put it into a form that gives you a full picture of the story chronologically, as best as I could determine that. With regard to this diary, I understand just today I read that that the diary that was actually published was not the original diary. She hand wrote her diary, as most people do if they keep diaries. They handwrite them. And it had a lot of information in there, a lot of her thoughts that she didn't want to share with the public. So what we have here is a typed version of the diary that she put together for publication purposes that includes a lot of information about her personal challenges. One of her big challenges was a challenge in determining whether she should marry or not. And we're going to get into that in the story. She struggled with marrying someone or marrying the faith, marrying Abdul Baha, in a sense. And you'll see what she decided as we get into this story. There's not very much told about her early years. In fact, there's very little description of her parents. And in fact, there's some confusing information about where she was actually born. In the New York Times death notice for Juliet Thompson, it says that she was born in New York. But in the introductions to a book that she wrote called I, Mary Magdalene, she intimates that she was born in Virginia, but raised in Washington. Then other sources say she was born in New York, but raised in Washington. So I looked at the number of, references, and ultimately decided to present this as a born September 23rd, 1873 in Washington, D.C., because she did spend a good deal of her childhood in Washington, D.C. At an early age, Juliet Hutchings Thompson became interested in painting. She was sent by her prominent Celtic Irish parents, James and Celeste Thompson, to study at the Corcoran Art School in Washington. We all know that because it's now a college, a university for artists. Her father died at the age of 12 and left little money for the family, but she had already made a name for herself selling paintings, financially supporting her family. She did mostly pastel portraits professionally. She did a lot of work on commission at the age of 17, at a very young age. And before Corcoran, there was no, college education. She went to art school. That's where she went. She was an active member of the artist community in DC. She painted a centerpiece of the 1897 Cosmos Club annual show. I know that club because years ago when Stanwood Cobb, Dr. Stanwood Cobb, was alive, I had the great opportunity to have lunch with him and other Baha'is at the Cosmos Club, which is a gentleman's club for those who are up in the ages, octogenarians, essentially, or higher. And she painted a centerpiece for that Cosmos Club annual show. She did portrait painting for Needler's Galleries in New York. Continued when later she moved to New York and she continued working with Needler. And she was responsible for helping to put together the first public portrait exhibit in the United States, believe it or not, in New York. The picture at the bottom is a picture of the Corcoran Art School student body and faculty at the turn of the century. So if this were a picture of Juliet Thompson attending the Corcoran School, this is pretty much what it would look like. The paintings in the back and the student body assembled with the faculty at the Corcoran Art School in Washington. By the mid-1890s, when she was in her early 20s, she had already made a name for herself. As I mentioned, around the turn of the century, the mother of Laura Clifford Barney, Alice Barney, invited this young artist from Washington to Paris, France, for further study. She studied at the Sorbonne, as a matter of fact, and a few other art schools. And Julia, when accompanied by her mother and her brother, it was there that she met May Bowles, otherwise known as May Maxwell, the mother of Head of the Cause Rahil Hanoum, the first Baha'i in the European continent. and through her accepted this new faith. It's interesting that Thomas Breakwell was introduced to the faith through May Bowles, Laura Clifford Barney, and other famous American Baha'is who happened to visit Paris were all introduced to the faith by May Bowles, a very important figure in the faith. Mrs. Barney wrote of Juliet that she had accepted the faith as naturally as a swallow takes to the air. That's a direct quote from Alice Barney and Laura Clifford Barney. Juliet became one of the first group of Paris Baha'is, which included Mrs. Barney, Laura Clifford Barney, Hippolyte Dreyfus Barney, who was the first French Baha'i, May Bowles, and Thomas Breakwell, the first English Baha'i. Enthusiasm and activity were at a high point, partly because of the presence of Mirza Abdul Fadl, a teacher sent by Abdul Baha to France to help form the Parisian and the French community, Baha'i community. His lessons, together with May Bowles' influence, were very confirming to Juliet, and the process was completed when Thomas Breakwell, the first English believer, gave her Count de Gobineau's stirring description of the martyrdom of the Bab. So she declared her belief in the Baha'i faith in Paris. From the beginning of her acceptance of the faith, she began serving it. Following her Paris sojourn, she spent most of the rest of her life in New York, and her studio there became a center for weekly Baha'i meetings every Friday night, Baha'i firesides. Juliet's great love for and devotion to the Master made her a natural channel for the spreading of the faith. Her enthusiasm was so soul-warming and contagious that through her, many people accepted the cause. She became a member of the National Arts Club and the Board of Control of the Pastelists, continuing to learn under American painter and teacher Kenneth Hayes Miller in New York City. She donated her art for support of various causes: an early free clinic, women's suffrage, a project for minding children off the street, and relief for women and children in World War I. She never married, and this was a big struggle for her. She was approached by many men. Two prominent Baha'is who proposed to her were John Bosch, the founder of the Bosch School in California, an industrialist involved in the development of the railroad, an artist, Roy Wilhelm, Charles Mason, Admiral Remy's son, Charles Mason Remy, whom Abdul Baha wished her to marry. He's an architect, was not a poor man, was also very much interested in her. He met her in New York. They had frequent meetings in which they, in a friendly manner, discussed what it would be like if the two of them were married, what their children would be like. And Marjorie Gale, who helped her with her diary, wrote that Juliet told me that in those days, Mason had grown a red beard, and as they sat together, he would talk of the children they would have, and Juliet would visualize the Remy babies, each with a small red beard. She ultimately decided not to marry Charles Mason Remy. As we all know, he became a covenant breaker and left the faith. She moved to New York in circa 1902 to 48th West 10th Street, Greenwich Village. Here's a picture of that building that she occupied, the brownstone at the upper right. By the way, I checked it out. It was for sale, and I don't think the National actually bought it. It was for sale in 2020 for $12 million. She shared the brownstone with a fellow artist, Daisy Marguerite Pumpelly Smith, which was previously owned by the brother of the wife of Enrico Russo. So it has some famous prior owners. And the rumor was, though it was never confirmed, that it belonged to General Tom Thumb, the circus midget for Barnum and Bailey at one point. So a very interesting building. Mark Tobey, a fellow artist, posed for her in 1918. He was introduced to the faith while in her home, read Baha'i literature in her home, and then later went to Green Acre and converted to the Baha'i faith in Green Acre. So she influenced Mark Tobey as an artist to actually declare his belief in Baha'u'llah on a visit to Green Acre. Also, Khalil Gibran, famous author of The Prophet, The Madman, The Forerunner, The Son of Man, and Spiritualists, was a neighbor, lived right across the street from Juliet Thompson. And he later, and we will be discussing this later, met and painted the master in his own studio in that building across from the home of Juliet Thompson. The year after the master's release from the prison city of Akka, 1909, Juliet enjoyed a trip to Akka with the Kinney family, who made the pilgrimage to Haifa. It is not difficult to imagine her exultation on attaining to his longed-for goal of being released from the prison. On her return to New York, her meetings were resumed. Pages of a new volume were being written in the lives of many devoted American believers. All were looking forward to a possible visit of the master to the United States. But in Juliet's case, the interval of waiting seemed too long. And finally, in the summer of 1911, when the master was in Europe, she sought his presence first at Thonon-les-Bains, France, and then in Vevey on Lake Geneva in Switzerland. Eagerly, she listened to his vivifying words, and faithfully she recorded in her diary the priceless impressions of those days. So she wouldn't wait for him to come to the United States. She actually traveled to Europe, traveled to France, traveled to Switzerland to hear him speak, and actually took notes and recorded those notes in her diary. So there's a whole section in the diary devoted to the European trip that she took following Abdu'l-Baha. On April 11th, finally, 1912, Abdu'l-Baha arrived in New York, and when he stepped off the steamship Cedric, one of those who met him was Juliet Thompson. She met him at the dock. She kept a complete diary of the tremendous events that transpired during Abdu'l-Baha's visit in and around New York. And Abdu'l-Baha stayed in her home during his visits in New York City. Now, he had been all over the house. He blessed every part of the house. His living presence had blessed it all. In a dark corner of Juliet's whispering old studio stood a fragile armchair of black oak, surprisingly small, with a cord across it, none ever to sit in it again, the chair of Abdu'l-Baha. Kind of reminds me of the Washington Baha'i Center that has a chair that was sat in by Abdu'l-Baha. He loved her studio room. He said it was eclectic, part Oriental, part Occidental, and that he would like to build a similar one. She followed the master everywhere, attending all the meetings in New York, Brooklyn, New Jersey, and the master graciously addressed a gathering in her studio in mid-November 1912 on the distinctive qualities of the Baha'i Faith. Several times he called her to walk with him on Riverside Drive, accompanied by Valiullah Varga as interpreter. It was through her efforts that the rector of the Church of the Ascension in New York received him at a Sunday, April 14, 1912 evening service, seating the master in the bishop's chair beside the altar. Now, no one could believe it at the time that someone who was not a proclaimed Christian, although we all knew that he accepted Christianity as well as the other faiths, was occupying the bishop's chair at this Episcopalian church. Abdu'l-Baha spoke about his mission and answered many questions about the teachings. I do want to mention here that not only did she follow him to New York and Brooklyn and New Jersey, she followed him to Washington. I learned this today, that she was very well connected in Washington. I mentioned that her parents were prominent, but very little is known about them. My guess is that they were prominent in federal government because she knew a lot of federal government people. And you'll come to see who she knew as we go along here. She, in one account, she was friends with the Secretary of the Treasury under William Howard Taft's administration, and actually arranged for Abdu'l-Baha to meet with him and have lunch with him. And there's an excerpt in which she asked this person by the name of Lee Klung what he thought of Abdu'l-Baha. And he gives a very eloquent response to that question. But He even, Abdul-Baha even met with William Howard Taft, President William Howard Taft. So she was very well connected in Washington. She was kind of I would call her the Baha'i Pamela Harriman of the Baha'i community at the time. Now, the Church of the Ascension. This is the Church of the Ascension, which was just down the street from Juliet Thompson's home. It's an Episcopalian church. And the rector of the church was Reverend Percy Stickney Grant. You can see in his bio he was very prestigious background, prominent figure in controversy surrounding the 1907 establishment of an open forum on socialism, his views on divorce in the Episcopalian Church. He was born in Boston, graduated from Harvard, received his theological training at the Episcopal Theological School in Cambridge, ordained a deacon in 1886, a priest in 1887. Now, the interesting story on Percy Grant is that even before Abdul-Baha showed up, as a matter of fact, when she went to Akka to visit Abdul-Baha, she must have mentioned Percy Grant to Abdul-Baha because she was in love with him then. And Abdul-Baha gave her some advice about this gentleman at the time in Akka. But she carried on a 17-year platonic relationship with this gentleman. She was so impressed with him. She attended his services on Sunday, and they were very, very close friends. She was in love with this strong-willed Grant who loved her, but was known to be a ladies' man with multiple female interests. He tried to lure Juliet away from her faith, denouncing the Baha'i sect. On the pulpit, he was saying derogatory things about anything coming from the East and the Baha'i sect itself in terrible terms, to try to influence her to give up her newfound faith and become a Christian and part of his parish. The master told her when he arrived that he must commit to her and they must marry or they must break up. And Juliet chose the latter, but she never got over that. And later it became apparent to Juliet that the only reason why the Reverend Grant gave Abdul-Baha the opportunity to speak in this church was to appease Juliet, a peace offering to Juliet, whom he admired so much. But as it turned out, he was, because of his becoming such a ladies' man, he was ultimately embroiled in a scandal when a parishioner caught him in the arms of a wealthy Cuban woman at the church, who donated $60,000 to his private residence. Later found out that he was having affairs with other people. And all this became apparent to his parishioners. And on a Sunday, when he showed up to actually deliver his sermon, his name was taken down from the queue and he was asked to leave the church. So he lost his position, he lost his congregation. He ultimately had to return the $60,000 that he borrowed from the woman, which left him destitute. So it's an interesting story here. And she, for some time after this, in fact, she was so in love, Julia was so in love that she helped raise money in the parish to help Percy Grant raise the money to pay back the $60,000. That's how much she was in love with him. She never really got over this until she made the commitment to devote herself entirely to the faith and to Abdul-Baha. And I would imagine that a lot of the information that was extracted from her original diary was information about this struggle that she was going through. There's still a lot of it in the existing diary. There are a lot of quotes and excerpts in which she asked Abdul-Baha time and time again, should I marry him? Should I not marry him? Should I be married? And Abdul-Baha gives her answers. And we'll read some of those excerpts a little bit later on if we have some time here. This is the inside of that church, and you can just visualize Abdul-Baha being on the altar there, speaking to the congregation. Here's an interesting anecdote. These other pictures are contemporary pictures of the church, which I received just last week from Shidan Majidi, who lives in New York. He is the creator of Me, the Other, who posted these on Facebook. So I figured I would show you these contemporary pictures, and you could see that the messages that are conveyed outside this church are probably not the messages that Percy Grant would accept in his day and age. Black Lives Matter, refugees and immigrants are welcome here. You know, these are messages that are contemporary. So the church has probably changed quite a bit since the time of Percy Grant. This is an image of the New York Times article that which was published on April the 21st, 1912, a week after he delivered that sermon in the Church of the Ascension, heralding the coming of Abdu'l-Baha, telling the world that this is a person who has arrived in the United States and spoke at the church. And this is what he stands for. Time has come, he says, for humanity to hoist the standard of the oneness of the human world so that dogmatic formulas and superstitions may end. Now, I mentioned to you that Lydia Gibran lived right across the street from the home of Juliet Thompson. They became friends even before Abdu'l-Baha arrived in New York. They visited each other. They enjoyed each other's company. They both were authors and artists. They believed in the unity of religion, mysticism, and spirituality. Juliet was attracted to his drawings and his paintings, more so his drawings than his paintings. He was Lebanese, and he had the great privilege of painting poet W.B. Yeats, the composer Claude Debussy, and the sculptor Auguste Rodin. So he had some famous people that he had painted in his life, and had the ultimate privilege of talking Juliet into getting Abdu'l-Baha to sit for a painting of Abdu'l-Baha, which he painted in pretty much in an hour, because that's the only amount of time that Abdu'l-Baha granted him, 1 hour at 6:30 one morning at the home of Khalid Gibran. They had many conversations. He was very, very interested in the faith. Abdu'l-Baha shared with him some of the Arabic writings of Baha'u'llah, which he referred to as the most stupendous literature ever written. That was his impression. As I mentioned, he visited the master several times in Juliet's home, followed him around at the New York activities, at the Boston activities, keeping in mind that he was born in Boston, so he's familiar with Boston. He seemed to be a very sad man, high-pitched voice, high, broad forehead, very sensitive person. Juliet referred to him kiddingly as the splitting image of Charlie Chaplin, which he did not appreciate. There's actually a YouTube video on this. I took this information from a YouTube video, and I guess it was almost a violent reaction being referred to as Charlie Chaplin, maybe because his life was so serious to him and his work was so serious. About the master, he described the master as a very great man, majestic, genial, complete, worlds in his soul. And oh, what a remarkable, beautiful face. Now, a lot of people believe that the prophet was based upon the life of Abdu'l-Baha or even Baha'u'llah, but in fact, that was not the case. It's his book, The Son of Man, which he wrote, in which he says he thought of Abdu'l-Baha all through it. So if anyone has had the opportunity to read The Son of Man, Abdu'l-Baha was his vision when he wrote that book. Now, Juliet had the great opportunity to do a painting, a portrait of Abdu'l-Baha as well. She reached the pinnacle of success and happiness when the master granted her request to paint his portrait in June 1911. Now, this she executed in pastels. Unfortunately, pastels are not long lasting and they're somewhat perishable. So the painting itself was eventually lost. So what we have available to us are some photographic reproductions of the portrait, such as this one. This is a photographic reproduction of the portrait. You can see how beautiful it is, the eyes. And I wasn't going to read this until the end, but let me read it now because I think it's so important. Let me read this. This is, if I could find it. Well, I'll read it. I'll read it later. I'm sorry. We'll read it. It's one of the excerpts. In it, he asked Juliet to paint his servitude to God. He didn't want a painting of himself. He wanted a painting of his servitude. So when you look at this painting, do you think that Juliet captured his servitude? She struggled with the thought. She says, how am I to even visualize what your servitude means? But in my view, she did a pretty good job of a person looking up with great humility and great servitude. Now, one of the reproductions was on display at the Second World Congress. And this is an interesting anecdote. One is just outside the members' meeting room of the seat of the Universal House of Justice in Haifa. So when the members of the Universal House of Justice enter and leave the meeting room in which they deliberate, this painting is available to them. Ms. Thompson was by now a well-known portrait painter, executing many commissions in New York and Washington. Among these was a portrait of the First Lady, then First Lady, Miss Calvin Coolidge. And what's funny about this, as she was painting Calvin Coolidge's wife's picture, the president, Calvin Coolidge, was watching, munching on an apple and annoying Juliet Thompson. And she told the First Lady, I can't take much more of this, which I thought was rather funny, that she was being distracted by the president in painting the picture of Calvin Coolidge's wife, Grace. Now, I share with you some of her portraits and her drawings. She did a portrait, and this appears to be a photograph of the portrait of Bahia Hanum, the sister of Abdul Baha. This is Laura in black. I have a feeling this is a painting of Laura Clifford Barney. Alice Pike Barney is the mother of Laura Clifford Barney. Grace Coolidge is the painting that you see that she was painting in this picture. That is the picture of First Lady Grace Coolidge, wife of Calvin Coolidge. The two paintings on the left at the bottom are not titled, but they are alleged to be among her works. At the bottom is The Lady in White. Next to it is a self-portrait, an early self-portrait she painted herself. And then to the far right, she painted Percy Grant's picture, the rector of the Church of the Ascension. She struggled with the time she was devoting to her art and the time she was devoting to her faith. And she asked Abdul Baha, how do you balance these interests? And this is what he said to her. You have two arts, one physical, the other spiritual. With your physical art, you paint the images of men. With your spiritual art, you paint the images of the angels. And at last, I hope you will be enabled to paint the perfections of God. Your physical art will at last end, but your spiritual art is everlasting. Your physical art can be done by many, but your spiritual art is not the work of everyone. Your physical art makes you dear to men, but your spiritual art makes you dear to God. Therefore, work to perfect both of them. That's a quote from Juliet Thompson to her. This is an important slide. Finally, Abdul Baha left the Baha'is of the United States of America on December the 5th, 1912, on the Celtic. And who was there? Juliet Thompson. She was there to greet him when he arrived. She was there to see him off. And I'm going to read her departure depiction from the diary as we get into the excerpts. But you can see he's on board. She and other Baha'is actually went up into the ship and sat with him in his cabin before it took off. Her article, Abdu'l-Baha, the Center of the Covenant, which she wrote later, gives examples of the responses of people from all walks of life to the dynamic personality of the masters, responses which in most cases she herself witnessed. Then came World War I. During this time, the communications with Abdu'l-Baha and with the Holy Land were cut off because of the war going on. But throughout this time of trial and testing, Juliet did not lose the vision of the Baha'i promise of peace. In collaboration with her spiritual mother, May Maxwell, May Bowles, she collected the utterances of Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Baha on this subject. These were published in 1918 under the title Peace Compilation. Because of her ardent advocacy of peace, Juliet attracted the attention of federal agents. This is interesting. Maybe they thought that she was an iconoclast, someone who didn't believe in her country. I don't know what motivated federal agents to follow her, but some of whom were present at meetings in her home. So federal agents were actually attending some of her meetings. She was never afraid. She knew she spoke the teachings of God for this day. Throughout her entire Baha'i career, she was courageous, staunch, and firm as a rock in her faith. That Juliet was a sensitive writer was demonstrated in her book, I, Mary Magdalene, published in 1940. I have not read the book. I have not been able to find anything about the details of it, except what are reflected here. Here she paints with words a portrait of the woman whose life was deeply influenced by the teachings of Jesus the Christ, just as Juliet's own life had been galvanized by the radiant loving kindness and wisdom of Abdu'l-Baha. So this is an interesting book because I can visualize that she's putting herself in the position of Mary Magdalene and Abdu'l-Baha in the position of Jesus. As a matter of fact, I read just today that she had drawings in the book, and in the drawings, her face was the face of Mary Magdalene. And Abdul's face was the face of Jesus in the book. So if anybody could find this book, please share it with all of us, because I would love to see what that looks like. But this is a very sincere book in which she's actually pouring out the love for Abdu'l-Baha through the love of Mary Magdalene for Jesus Christ. This book has been characterized by Stanwood Combs, a famous Baha'i teacher who lived in the area for a long time, as one of the most graphic and lofty delineations of Christ ever made in literature. Juliet was for many years a member of the Spiritual Assembly of New York, a delegate to the annual convention. In 1926, she made with Mary Maxwell, the daughter of her beloved friend and teacher, a second pilgrimage to the Holy Land. After years of service in New York, and not long after Shoghi Effendi had sent the first Baha'i pioneer teachers to Latin American countries, Juliet spent over a year teaching in Mexico. Nothing is written about her sojourn in Mexico, but she spent a full year teaching in Mexico. I want to read some of the descriptions of this lady that I gleaned from all the writings that I was able to find. Fearless Baha'i teacher, lived for a much higher purpose, courageous and staunch belief in Baha'u'llah's unifying vision, fought tirelessly for the emancipation of women and an end to war, gifted with an innate talent for painting, a natural channel for spreading the faith, dynamic personality, a center around which Baha'i thought revolved, seamlessly ageless, profound spiritual sensibilities, a great advocate for world peace, always remained jolly and steadfast, outstanding exemplary handmaiden of Abdu'l-Baha, one so wholly consecrated to the faith, always a rebel, sympathy and true love, outspoken, absolute truthfulness, artist's eye and writer's pen. In time to come, this is interesting, queens will wish they had been the maid of Juliet. That's a quote from Abdu'l-Baha. In time to come, queens will wish they had been the maid of Juliet. A cult figure. Her mother said, "You're not beautiful, you're not handsome, you are lovely." There is magic in Juliet's eyes, a boiling heart. There's an excerpt in which May Maxwell and Louis Getzinger and Juliet were together with Abdu'l-Baha in Juliet's home, and he was asking each one of them, "What kind of a heart do you have?" And when he got to Juliet, Juliet said, "I don't know, an emotional heart." He said, "Juliet, you have a boiling heart." And he said, "If all the three of you, the hearts of all three of you were put together, oh, what a heart we would have." So he referred to her heart as a boiling heart. Abdu'l-Baha said, "Everybody's your friend." When he went to Washington, D.C., he was impressed by how many people knew Juliet Thompson. And he said, "Everybody is your friend." Sincerity, absolute, perfect, extraordinary truth. These are the descriptions that you will see in the writings about Juliet Thompson. In later years of her life, she was incapacitated physically. This is in the late 70s, 80s. Nevertheless, wherever she was, there was a center, she was the center around which Baha'i thought and activity revolved. Doubtless, many of her friends did not realize the seriousness of the heart ailment that afflicted her because of her spirit was so alive and vibrant. One reference to her prior sickness was when she arrived in France to study at the Sorbonne. One day she had diphtheria. She was suffering from diphtheria. And she had a vision of a man, a beautiful man in the vision. And it was a vision of Abdu'l-Baha. And it was when she went to Mabel's home and was acquainted with the actual picture or story of the picture of Abdu'l-Baha that she realized that her vision was the vision of Abdu'l-Baha. Here, she was suffering from a heart ailment. Although she was then in her early 80s, those close to her who never thought of age in connection with Juliet, she seemed ageless. Her earthly life came to an end on December 4th, 1956, in 120. She actually moved in her later years to 129 East 10th Street, New Rochelle, New York. So she did not die in Greenwich Village, she died in New Rochelle. She is buried at Beechwood Cemetery, New Rochelle, New York Plot 993, Section 20. This is this picture on the left is a picture of the plaque that exists at her gravesite, which reflects the quote of Shoghi Effendi upon hearing the news of the passing of Juliet Thompson. A memorial service was held for her at the Baha'i House of Worship in Wilmette. The notable people who spoke or sent messages were the hands of the cause Paul Haney, Charles Mason Remy, Horace Holly, and Amelia Collins, and later Universal House of Justice member Charles Wolcott. The quote from Shoghi Effendi upon hearing the news, which is reflected in the plaque, says, "Deplore loss of much loved, greatly admired Juliet Thompson, outstanding, exemplary handmaid of Abdu'l-Baha, over a half-century record of manifold meritorious services, embracing concluding years of heroic and opening decades of formative age of Baha'i dispensation, won her enviable position in glorious company of triumphant disciples of beloved master in Abha kingdom. Advise holding a memorial gathering in Mashriq al-Askar to pay befitting tribute to the imperishable memory of one who was so wholly consecrated to the Baha'i Faith of Baha'u'llah and fired with such consuming devotion to the center of his covenant." Signed, Shoghi December the 6th, 1956. Then he cabled Daisy Smith, who was her companion at the home in Greenwich Village, deeply grieved, her reward assured, December the 7th, 1956. And now I'm going to read some of the excerpts from the diary to share with you. I think probably the most important one is the painting of Abdu'l-Baha. And at 298, bear with me. Let me read this to you. The master has begun to pose for me. He had said, can you paint me in a half hour? So Abdu'l-Baha was asking her to paint him in half an hour. A half hour, my lord, I stammered, appalled. I could never finish a head in less than 2 weeks. Well, I will give you 3 half hours. You mustn't waste my time, Juliet. He told me to come to him Saturday morning, June 1st at 7:30. I went in a panic. He was waiting for me in the entrance hall, a small space in the English basement where the light, not much of it, comes from the south. In fact, I found myself faced with every kind of handicap. I always paint standing, but now I was obliged to sit, jammed so close to the window because of the lack of distance between the master and me that I couldn't even lean back. No light, no room, and I had bought a canvas for a life-sized head. The master was seated in a dark corner, his black abba melting into the background, and again I saw him as the face of God and quailed. How could I paint the face of God? I want you, he said, to paint my servitude to God. Oh, my Lord, I cried. Only the Holy Spirit could paint your servitude to God. No human hand could do it. Pray for me, or I am lost. I implore you, inspire me. I will pray, he answered. As you are doing this only for the sake of God, you will be inspired. And then an amazing thing happened. All fear fell away from me, and it was though someone else saw through my eyes, worked through my hand. All the points, all the planes in that matchless face were so clear to me that my hand couldn't put them down quickly enough, couldn't keep pace with the clarity of my vision. I painted in ecstasy, free as I never had painted before. At the end of the half hour, the foundation of the head was perfect. Very inspiring. So she received the grace of God as she was painting, doing this very difficult painting in a half hour of the servant of God. The next I want to read is The Departure, on page 349. Bear with me. See if I have the right one. See, the departure is 390, sorry. It's a little bit long, so bear with me. He asked me to come to the Emery's, where he had been staying for a few days, the morning of December the 5th, the day of his sailing. And I was there at 8 o'clock. That last morning, I stood at the door of his room, gazing in my eyes drinking their fill, if there ever could drink their fill, of this divine figure as he sat or stood or moved around the room. He called me in twice. The second time he took my hand. Remember, he said, I am with you always. Baha'u'llah will be with you always. Rest assured, he said, when I told him that she will be, his mother, she reported that her mother was ill. And he says, rest assured, he said, that she will be healed. And he filled my arms with fruit for her. We drove to the boat and followed him up to his cabin. Many believers were crowding the cabin. Later, we all went upstairs and sat in a large room with him. Very soon he rose and walking up and down delivered to us his last spoken message. First, he described heartbreakingly the war now raging in the Balkans. Then he said, as to you, your efforts must be lofty. Exert yourselves with heart and soul, that perchance through your efforts, the light of universal peace may shine, and this darkness of estrangement and enmity may be dispelled amongst men. You have no excuse to bring before God if you fail to live according to his command, for you are informed of that which constitutes the good pleasure of God. This is the message for all of us. Since we're all informed, we have no excuse to bring before God, right, for failing to accomplish his mission. It is my hope that you may become successful in this high calling, so that like brilliant lamps, you may cast light upon the world of humanity and quicken and stir the body of existence like unto a spirit of light. This is eternal glory. This is everlasting felicity. This is the immortal life. This is heavenly attainment. This is being created in God's image and likeness. And unto this, I call you, praying to God to strengthen and bless you. He seated himself again in a corner of the large cabin. All the believers flocked around him. I sat opposite him at a little distance, weeping quietly. A great fear had taken possession of me. A question risen in my mind, which must be answered, or I should have no peace. I should be left in a frantic state. I arose and walked over to him and stood before him. My Lord, I said, each time I have parted from you in Haifa, in Europe, you have said, you will call me again to you. Each time you gave me hope that I would see you again. But this time you gave me no hope. Won't I see you again, my Lord? This is my hope, he replied. But still you don't tell me, my Lord, and it makes me feel hopeless. You must not feel hopeless, he said. This was all, he said to me. It killed me. While I sat weighed down with despair and grief, he drew from an inside pocket the purse of Dr. Grant that Dr. Grant had sent him last summer, laid it on my knee and looked at me. To me, it seemed a promise that he himself would take care of Percy. This is the Percy that had to give back the $60,000. This was the very last. This was the very last. It was death to leave that ship. I stood on the pier with May Maxwell, tears blurring my sight. Through them, I could see the master in the midst of the group of Persians, waving a patient hand to us. It waved and waved, that beautiful patient hand, till the figure was lost to sight. So it's a depiction of the departure of NOVA from New York. Keep in mind that he had essentially circled the United States during his stay, traveling all over, including Washington, D.C., Stanford University in California, and other locations. I'm going to read a story, see if we have some time for this. And Sharon, I had mentioned this to you. This is something that I found, and I misinterpreted it when I shortly before I mentioned it to you. This is a story that is not actually in the diary that was published. And it could have been a story that was extracted and later published independently, but it's allegedly from the diary of Juliet Thompson, dated July 9th, 1912, New York, New York. After I read it, I'm going to ask you what you thought of this and what you thought the meaning of it was. On Monday, 9 July, the master invited me with the Persians to go to the Natural History Museum in New York. This is not the one in Washington. It was a broiling afternoon, and I couldn't imagine why he should want to go to the museum. And in the hottest part of the day, but wherever he went, there I wanted to be. When we reached the 9th Avenue corner of the museum, the master, exhausted by that time, sank to a low stone ledge to rest. Between us and the main door on the Central Park corner stretched a long cross-town block in glaring sun, not a single tree on the sidewalk. My lord, I said, let me try to find a nearer entrance for you. And I hurried along the grass, keeping close to the building, searching the basement for a door. The employee's entrance was locked. Just beyond stood a sign saying, no thoroughfare. I was rushing past this when a shrill whistle stopped me, and I turned to face the watchman on the grounds. He was a little bent old Jewish man with a very kind face. Oh, excuse me, I said, for breaking the rules, but I must find a nearer door than the main one. See who is sitting on that ledge? I must find it for him. The watchman turned and looked at the master, looked and looked at that figure from the East, from the past, the days of the Old Testament, and his eyes became very soft. Is he a Jew? He asked. A descendant of Abraham, said Juliet. Come with me, said the watchman. Ask him to come with me. I went over and spoke to the master, and he rose and followed with the Persians, I dropping back to walk with them. It was not a nearer entrance, but the watchman, taking a risk, perhaps led us across the grass, or at least it was cooler and the way shorter. In the museum, we passed through a room in which a huge whale hung from the ceiling. The master looked up at it, laughed, and said, he could hold 70 Jonahs. Then he took us straight to the Mexican exhibit, and this seemed to interest him very much. In the great elaborately carved glyphs standing around the room, he found traces of Persian art and pointed them out to me. He told us this sculpture resembled very closely the ancient sculpture of Egypt. Only, he said, this is better. Then he took me over to the cases where he showed me the purely Persian bracelets. I have heard a tradition that in the very distant past, this country and Asia were connected. Mexico and Asia were connected. This is from Abdul-Baha. Assuredly, answered the master, before a great catastrophe, there was such a connection between Asia and America. After looking at everything in the museum, in Mexican rooms, he led us to the front door and out into the grounds again. Then stepping from the stone walk to the grass, he seated himself beneath a young birch tree, his back to us, while we stood behind him on the flags. He sat there a long time, silent. Was he waiting for someone, I wondered? While he waited, in question mark, the old Jewish watchman stole quietly up to me from the direction of the museum. Is he tired? He whispered. Who is he? He looks like such a great man. He is Abdul-Baha of Persia, I said. And he has been a great sufferer because of his work and for the real brotherhood of man, the uniting of all races and nations. I should like to speak to him, said the watchman. And I took him over to the tree. Under which the master still sat with his back to us. At the sound of our footsteps, he turned and looked up at the watchman, his brilliant eyes full of sweetness. Come and sit by me, he said. Thank you, sir, but I am not allowed. Is it against the rules for me to sit on the grass? The old man's eyes, softly shining, were fixed on the master. No, you may sit there all day. Such pictures as I see when the master is in them could never be put upon, upon canvas, not even into words, except by the sublimest poet. But I always want to try at least to leave a trace of their beauty. The master, luminous in the sunlight, his white robe flowing to the grass, standing beside the white slender trunk of the birch tree with its leafy canopy over his head. The Jewish watchman standing opposite him, so bent, so old, his eyes like a lover's, humbly raised to the face of his own Messiah, as yet unrecognized his Messiah, yet his heart worshipped. Eagerly he went on, offering all he could think of to this mysterious one who had touched him so deeply. You didn't see the whole of the museum, that watchman said. Would you like to go back after you rested? You didn't go to the third floor. The fossils and the birds are up there. Wouldn't you like to see the birds? The master answered very gently, smiling, I am tired of traveling and looking at the things of this world. I want to go above and travel and see in the spiritual world. What do you think about that? He asked, suddenly beaming on the old watchman. The watchman looked puzzled and scratched his head. Which would you rather possess? Continued the master, the material or the spiritual world? Still the old man pondered. At last he brought forth, well, I guess the material. You know you have that anyway. And Abdullah said, but do you not lose it when you have attained the spiritual world? When you go upstairs in a house, you don't leave that house. The lower floor is under you. Oh, I see, cried the watchman, his whole face lighting up. I see. After we parted from the watchman, who walked us all the way to the 9th Avenue corner, leading us again across the grass, I began to blame myself for not inviting him to the master's house, forgetting that the master himself had not done so. But she kept asking the question, why had the master visited a museum of natural history in the hottest hour of the blistery day? And later she says, many years later, in 1947, there may have been two meanings to that visit to the museum. And the second meaning I could not have thought of till 1940, when I became so deeply involved in the Baha'i work in Mexico and completely at one in heart and spirit with the believers there. So my question to you is, why did Abdu'l-Baha visit the Natural History Museum in the heat of summer? What do you think? What was the reason that Juliet ultimately realized when she was working in Mexico?
Because he wanted to meet the Jewish guy and see the Jewish and the Christian with him, and bring some unity among them. It's just a thought.
And to elevate his thoughts from the material which he sees every day in his museum to the spiritual realm, right? To let him know that all these things that are important in his life as a watchman at a museum are secondary to the spiritual realm, which is above the material realm. So he saw in it an opportunity to teach, and he knew, I'm sure he knew, he would meet this watchman because he's Abdu'l-Baha. Interesting, very interesting.
Well, isn't it because he knew that he was about to die?
That could be it too.
Because I
That could
thought
be
he
it.
died the next day, the watchman.
Well, it says that he was old.
I mean,
And that
I
he
read
was
it
bent.
somewhere that he died the next day or something.
That is very true. Yes, I read that too. Yes.
Is that right? And he died shortly there. So I guess he was preparing him for the Abha kingdom.
I
Yes.
think so, yeah.
No, very interesting, very interesting. Well, it is 8:49. I'm not beyond my time. I think we still have room for more. So let me, this is a beautiful concept. This is page 149. Now, this was written in the diary, recorded in the diary in 1936, but it actually is a recollection of her experience in Akka. Okay, which leads me to believe, based upon what she's saying in this, that she shared a lot of her intimate thoughts with Abdu'l-Baha while she was in Akka. And Abdu'l-Baha gave her advice. In Akka, I have looked upon the mystery of love and of incarnate sacrifice. I returned this vision filling my eyes, blinding me to all lesser values. This and the fact that I was so immature, both spiritually and in worldly wisdom, caused me to become myself, the instrument of the devastation. But I devastated not my country alone, but others. When this winter I read my diary of 1910, I was crushed with shame and remained so for weeks because of my blind, cruel blundering all through that awful year. Then came a flash of what I believed to be perception, and this had comforted me. My Lord Abdu'l-Baha, who saw the end where I saw only the beginning, and in whose compassionate hands are the lives of all, had in reality offered me two choices. First, my own will, then his will, or what appeared to be his will. Though I played my small part so miserably, at least I chose the master's will. When in my extremity I still clung desperately to his will, he released me from my engagement to Mason Remy, whom Abdu'l-Baha recommended she marry. As for the other man, and I think we by now all know who he is, Percy Grant. As I review the whole drama of my connection with his life, ending in tragedy, it is clear that at every crisis, something diviner than fate stood between us. Abdu'l-Baha had another plan for me. This, I believe, was his plan from the beginning. So here she's talking about the struggle that she had with her love for Percy Grant, the encouragement of Abdu'l-Baha for her to marry Charles Mason Remy. Keep in mind that he was not, even though he appeared to be a matchmaker, he was open to her marrying anyone who shared her thoughts and beliefs. And as you can see the quote at the top, make him a believer, in which in Akka, Abdu'l-Baha is telling her, I know this man, I could feel for this man based upon what you told me. I wish for you to marry, provided make him a believer so he shares your thoughts. Why was it important for him to tell her to make him a believer? Because he went so far astray in his own life when she finally returned to New York that he was the wrong person for her. It was very obvious. But she's saying in this writing that Abdu'l-Baha had a plan for her right from the beginning. He knew at that time that she was in Akka that she was not going to marry Percy. She was not going to marry Charles Mason Remy, that she was going to devote herself entirely to the faith because of her dear heart and her love for the writings of Baha'u'llah. So I'm going to move now to the next slide, close this, if it will work. You know why I'm struggling with this. It's not going down. Here it is. No. I want to go back up. Here we go. No. I don't know why I'm skipping it. Questions. By the way, the references are there for you. Anybody would like to look up these references, including the YouTube references at the bottom there. There's the talk about Juliet Thompson and Khalid Gibran at the bottom, vignettes from the life of Juliet Thompson. There are a couple of presentations on the life of Juliet Thompson in Spanish. And for those of you who speak Spanish, you could check them out. But there's quite a bit out there on Juliet Thompson. It's a never-ending story. You always pick up something that you wish you had included. And I kept the search up right to the last minute to make sure I captured everything. Now, my questions for you. What do you believe were the pivotal events in Juliet's life which propelled her to her spiritual mission? I'll throw one out there, and that is her visit to France and her introduction to the faith through May Bowles, Laura Clifford Barney, Thomas Breakwell was somewhat of a start for her. You know, do you think of anything else?
You know, I was going to say, John, this is Sharon, that, you know, then of course, meeting the master, Mirza Abdul Fadl. I mean, these are just the spiritual backbone of our faith, you know, so.
Right. And of course, her place was essentially the focal point for Baha'i teachings in New York. She you know, it was some describe it almost as a madhouse where people were coming and going constantly. And she was regularly teaching the faith, and others were teaching the faith at her home. So continuing the mission that Abdul Baha gave her in Akka by teaching so many people, introducing artists and authors to the faith and to Abdul Baha from her home, certainly helped her to develop her spiritual mission. What qualities does she exude which evidence her spiritual growth and station? I read some of them in that list of qualities. Anybody think of anything else? She was very direct, very, very honest, very truthful.
Is the video on?
There's a story. I'm sorry.
I'm going to bed.
There's a story about her truthfulness. She accompanied Abdul Baha on his visit to Wilmette for the dedication of the foundation of the house of worship. And Abdul Baha said to her, "What do you think of the house of worship?" And she bluntly said, "I don't like it. It looks like a wedding cake." And others were taken back by her comment. And he responded, Abdul Baha responded by saying, "This is what I love about you, Juliet. You are so truthful. You are so absolutely truthful that when I ask you something, I get exactly what you're thinking and exactly how you feel." What was Abdul Baha telling her through the relationship, throughout her relationship about her marriage? I didn't get to read some of the excerpts from the diary, but telling her to transfer her devotion to God from her devotions to people was a pretty good indication of her message to her, his message to her. And it almost became a prophecy, a foretelling prophecy, that the people that she was devoted to, that she thought were possible mates for life, turned out not to be the right people from their own conduct and their own events, the events in their lives.
Actually, I had a
But he
thought.
clearly, go ahead.
This is Margie. I'm actually wondering if
Margie.
not, hi, by the fact that she didn't marry, she gave more of herself to the faith, and we benefited from that,
Yes.
from her not marrying. on some
Absolutely.
level. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. As I mentioned, I truly believe that Abdul Baha knew that she was headed in that direction and would ultimately arrive at that state when he met her the first time.
But it's
You know, it's
interesting.
like,
I'm sorry, John.
go ahead, Sharon.
I think it's interesting. Your earlier slide mentioned that Abdul Baha tried to bring her together with Mason Remy. Did I see
Well,
that correctly?
Well, at the time, Mason Remy was the architect of a lot of the construction and the work that was being done in the Holy Land, in Akka. Very famous, very wealthy, and a hand in the cause.
Yeah, but
so-
isn't it interesting that when he fell away from the faith, you know, that
You know,
she didn't align herself with him.
yeah. Yeah, it is interesting that he probably knew where he was headed, but was still encouraging a marriage. Maybe he thought that a marriage with her would save him.
That's exactly what I was thinking, John, that maybe
Yeah,
it would, and it could, we don't know if it would have or could have, but that was very interesting.
yeah. But it's an interesting thought. Interesting thought that he was headed in the wrong direction, and maybe through marrying her, she could convince him to move back in the right direction.
But
And then move to,
sorry,
go ahead.
I don't want to like start a discussion about masonry, but from everything that we read, this, you know, he was a very loyal and he was an extremely, I mean, he did so many magnificent things, and it was only at the end that unfortunately I don't think
Yeah.
anyone was seeing any signs of him going wayward, and
That's correct. It's just in the latter part of his life that he, viewed himself as the titular head of the faith in the United States, when there could be only one leader in the faith, and that was Abdul Baha and Shoghi Effendi. So yeah, there was a problem there. It's an interesting story. Now, the most difficult question, I'd say for last, what lessons and insights do we gain from Juliet's life, which we can apply to our own lives?
example of dedication and consecration of your life to the faith.
Absolutely. Not to be distracted by earthly relationships and material things, but to devote yourself to the cause of the faith. Any other thoughts on this? Well, thank you again for this opportunity to share this story with everyone. I hope you do some. Thank you. And there will be more to come. I think, Payman, if you're going to tell a little bit about what's to follow in this series. There's a gentleman who is advocating delivering, I guess, the next presentation on Leroy Iwas's life.
Yes, I think Danush Rasech is going to do something, and I believe he's being joined by Hillary Chapman, and they are planning to maybe, we haven't done the date yet, but maybe in next month or in the coming months, they're going to do one on Leroy Iwas.
Okay.
So that would be the next.
My plan right now is to follow his presentation up with a presentation on the life of Louis Gregory.
Beautiful. Thank you.
And John, I used to have a copy of I, Mary Magdalene. I'm not finding it. I went to look at my bookshelf, but if I can find it, you're certainly welcome to read it.
I would definitely like to read it. Definitely like to read that.
Maybe you can
Thank you,
exchange
everyone.
emails or something on chat, private chat, if you like, between John and you, if you like.
Very
So,
good. Sounds good.
if there are any more comments or thoughts that anyone would like to share, please do so before we go to our closing and the prayer that we're going to share. You're more than welcome to ask any more questions or comments. Okay. Well, in that case, we're going to thank our dear John again, and it's really appreciated that we understand how much work and scholarly research has gone into this presentation, and you brought some very, very interesting points that I'm sure a lot of us had not heard and have learned so much. So thank you very much. And we thank all our audience for attending tonight and being a part of this. And we hope to see you at the other events put on by the Northern Virginia Baha'i Center and others who joined. So Sundays, as you know, on every Sunday morning at 10:30, we have the wonderful talks that is given. and there are holy days that is shared. And then there are also some other friends, such as the Parhami family, who have these Saturday events that they do it as a family themselves, if through their organization. So there's really wonderful programs always going on, and it's so wonderful to see everyone at these events. So we're going to go ahead and close with a prayer. And then I forgot to mention that these recordings are all on the YouTube for the Northern Virginia Baha'i Center. So if you just go to YouTube and put Northern Virginia Baha'i Center, you'll be able to look at some of the past presentations. The first one John did was at the Baha'i Center, so it wasn't recorded, but the last one and some of the other presentations from other friends is on that channel. So thank you again, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we're going to end with a prayer. Thank you. Bear with me, please.
To be a Baha'i simply means to love all the world, to love humanity and try to serve it, to work for universal peace and universal brotherhood. To be a Baha'i simply means to love all the world, to love humanity and try to serve it, to work for universal peace and universal brotherhood. To be a Baha'i simply means to love all the world, to love humanity and try to serve it, to work for universal peace, universal brotherhood.
Charge you all that each one of you concentrate all the thoughts of your heart on love and unity. When a thought of war comes, oppose it by a stronger thought of peace. A thought of hatred must be destroyed by a more powerful thought of love. To teach is to learn is to work is to serve is to love is to die is to live is to strive, and to strive is to rise above all earthly limitations and enter the eternal realm, the eternal realm. I'd you all that each one of you concentrate all the thoughts of your heart on love and unity. When a thought of war comes, oppose it by a stronger thought of peace. A thought of hatred must be destroyed by a more powerful thought of love. By a more powerful thought of love. By a more powerful thought of love.
Thank you, dear friends. Have a wonderful evening, and we look forward to seeing you in the near future. And thank you again.
Thank
Thank
you very
you,
much.
Russo.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Bye-bye. Good night.
Night.
Good night. Bye-bye.